The second vision was even more impactful than the first. The scene shifted, showing me vast cities around the world, enormous urban centers teeming with millions of people going about their daily lives, completely unaware of what was about to unfold. I recognized Paris, New York, London, Tokyo, Dubai, and countless other metropolitan areas that represented the pinnacle of human achievement and wealth. "Look how they trust in man's abilities," Jesus said, pointing to the frenetic activity unfolding beneath us. "They have built towers that touch the sky and created networks that span the globe, but they have forgotten that all their strength is like grass that withers in a single day." The second place of death is every great city that has become like Babylon, trusting in human riches and wisdom instead of trusting in God. As I spoke these words, I witnessed something that challenged everything I thought I knew about the stability of modern civilization. It was scarcity of resources, total collapse, power cut. Those who trusted in human ability, instead of God's provision, will find themselves trapped in monuments to human pride that have become tombs for the unwary. Once again, I glimpsed divine mercy. Even in the midst of judgment, I witnessed believers in these cities had received supernatural warnings to leave before the calamity began. Families sold their belongings and moved to rural areas. People felt the guidance of the Holy Spirit to relocate despite the apparent safety of urban life. These faithful listened the gentle voice of God and they escaped the trap before it closed. Then the Lord showed the most complete and terrifying of all. The scene expanded to reveal entire regions of the earth that had become uninhabitable due to the convergence of natural disasters, wars, and supernatural judgments. Vast territories of what were once fertile lands were now devastated wastelands where no form of life could survive. "Look at the coastal regions where millions have chosen to live," Jesus said, pointing to areas on each continent. "When the great earthquake comes and the islands flee, when the mountains shift and the seas roar beyond their borders, these will become the fifth site of death. Those who remain near the coasts when the final tremors begin will be swept away by waters higher than the tallest buildings." I watched in awe and terror as immense tsunamis triggered by earthquakes of unprecedented magnitude devastated coastal cities around the world. Waves hundreds of meters high surged inland, tens of kilometers inland, engulfing everything in its path. The destruction was so total that entire metropolitan areas simply vanished beneath the turbulent waters, leaving no trace that millions of people had lived and worked there. The vision showed me how these coastal disasters were connected to deeper spiritual realities. The most devastated areas were those where humanity's rebellion against God had reached its peak, cities that had celebrated sin, persecuted believers, and proclaimed their independence from divine authority, were purified by the very elements God had created. But once again, divine mercy was manifested even in judgment. Believers in coastal areas had received supernatural warnings to move inland. Families felt an inexplicable urge to relocate despite their deep roots in the coastal communities. These obedient souls had listened to the still, small voice of the Holy Spirit and escaped destruction by following God's guidance instead of their own understanding. When those visions were over, Jesus turned to me with eyes that held both boundless love and urgent concern. "Jean-Baptiste said, 'You must return now and warn my people. Time is running out, and the events you witnessed will unfold in a matter of months, not years. Those who heed these warnings and trust in my provision, rather than their own strength, will be safe. But those who ignore them or delay their response will find themselves trapped in places of death when the final hour arrives." The love in his voice was overwhelming, but so was the urgency. I understood that this message was not meant to instill fear, but to offer hope and a way out to those who would listen and obey. God's judgments are always accompanied by mercy for those who seek Him with sincere hearts. I felt myself beginning to be drawn back into my earthly body. But Jesus had one last message for me. "Tell them that I am their only refuge," he said. "Tell them that no earthly refuge, no human system, no preparation will save them unless I am their foundation. Tell them to flee to me while there is still time, for I will soon come, and when I come it will be too late for those who have not reconciled with me." The bright light began to fade around me, and I felt the familiar weight of physical existence return. but the visions remained vivid in my memory, etched into my consciousness with a divine fire that would never be extinguished. As I felt myself being pulled back toward the wreckage on that rural French road, Jesus spoke one last time, and his words echoed through dimensions beyond human comprehension. These warnings are not given to create panic, Jean-Baptiste, but to provide a way out for those who have ears to hear. Faithfully share what you have seen, for the time of preparation is almost over, and the hour of testing is rapidly approaching. But before returning to my battered body, he showed me one last vision that would forever change my understanding of the urgency of these warnings. I found myself standing in what appeared to be a great assembly hall filled with millions of souls and realized that I was witnessing the judgment seat of Christ, where every believer would give an account of their life. What I saw there broke my heart. I watched countless Christians who had lived comfortable lives, who had attended church regularly and considered themselves faithful, standing before Jesus with empty hands. They had spent their earthly years building kingdoms that would not last, chasing dreams that would fade, and ignoring the signs of the times all around them. I saw priests and pastors who had preached prosperity instead of preparation, who had told their congregations that Christians would be raptured even before the tribulation came. I was speechless as I realized how many souls had been lost because of their false sense of security. I witnessed families who had mocked those who warned of the tribulation, who had called prepared believers extremists and fanatics, weeping as they understood how their pride had led them to destruction. But the most heartbreaking thing of all was seeing the parents standing before the throne, holding their children's hands, tears streaming down their faces, realizing how their negligence, their failure to heed God's warnings had cost their little ones everything. These weren't wicked people or deliberate rebels against God, they were simply unprepared. They were taken by surprise by events they had been warned about repeatedly but chose to ignore. The vision showed me families staying in dangerous coastal cities because they loved the ocean views more than the fear of God's judgment. I saw believers staying in large metropolitan areas because their careers and social connections mattered more to them than divine security. I witnessed Christians relying on their retirement savings and insurance policies instead of seeking God's supernatural provision for the future. However, the most tragic scenes involved those who had indeed heard specific warnings about the 5 places of death, but had justified their need to act. I saw a family on the coast of Brittany whom a prophetic voice had directly commanded to move inland, but they dismissed it as emotional manipulation. Their seaside home had been their pride and joy, and they could not imagine God asking them to abandon something so beautiful. When the great tsunami arrived, they were swept away in their sleep, clinging to possessions they had valued more than obedience. I witnessed the case of a wealthy banker in Paris who had had several dreams about the calamity but had convinced himself that his diversified portfolio would keep him from disaster. When disaster struck, and his fortune was transformed into worthless paper within hours. But perhaps more serious were the scenes involving religious leaders who had led entire congregations to destruction through false teachings and flawed theology. I observed priests and pastors who had preached that believers would never suffer tribulations standing before Jesus, trying to explain why they had left their faithful unprepared for the greatest trial in human history. Their good intentions could not excuse the devastation their errors had caused. As these judgment scenes unfolded before me, Jesus spoke words that pierced my soul like fiery arrows. Many of my own will perish, not because they have rejected me, but because they were not watchful. They did not listen, they did not prepare for what I clearly told them was going to happen. They love their comfort more than my warnings, their traditions more than my truth, their own wisdom more than my instructions. The vision then shifted to show me the remnant who had heeded the warnings and escaped the 5 places of death. These faithful believers shone with a light that made them seem like living stars against the darkness that had enveloped the earth. They had lost their earthly possessions, their comfortable lives, their social standing, but they had gained something infinitely more valuable. They had gained their lives. I saw families who had sold their homes in coastal areas and moved to remote mountainous regions, trusting in God's provision rather than their own financial security. Although they faced hardship and uncertainty, angels surrounded their humble dwellings, and they received divine provision daily. Their children sang praises, even while living in tents, because they understood that their parents has made the right decision at the most crucial moment. I witnessed believers fleeing the big cities just before the calamity, carrying what could fit in a single suitcase, but with hearts full of faith and obedience. They established communities in desert areas where they supported one another during the darkest days the world had ever seen. Their joy was palpable despite their circumstances, because they knew they had followed the voice of their pastor when he called them away from danger. Infinite compassion and absolute authority, John Baptist said. These scenes represent the decisions being made right now, in the days leading up to your return to earth. Every person who hears these warnings will decide whether to act on them or ignore them, whether to trust in my provision or in their own understanding, whether to value the eternal or the temporal. Tell them that I have shown you these visions not to terrify you, but to rescue you from the delusion that has gripped so many of my people. Tell them that preparation is not simply about having food and water stored up. While these things are important, true preparation lies in having a heart that can hear my voice clearly and the faith to obey immediately, even when my instructions seem to contradict human wisdom. The greatest tragedy of the coming tribulation will not be natural disasters or persecution, but the number of believers who will be caught off guard, unprepared for having chosen comfort over obedience, tradition over revelation, human reasoning over of divine instruction. But for those who have eyes to see and ears to hear, these warnings offer a clear path to safety for themselves and their families. Remember, I am the same God who warned Noah before the flood, who told Lot to flee before the destruction of Sodom, who instructed the Israelites to put blood on their doorposts before the angel of death passed through Egypt. I have always warned my people before judgment came, and I warn them now through visions like yours and through the clear signs manifesting all around them. Time is running out, John Baptist. The events you witnessed will begin to unfold months after your return. Those who act immediately in response to these warnings will find refuge and sustenance in the safe places I have designated, but those who delay, those who justify their decisions, those who convince themselves that surely God would not require such difficult choices, His people, will discover too late that my words are not suggestions, but commands that determine life or death. As Jesus spoke these last words, I felt an irresistible force pulling me back into my physical body. Lying on the French country road, the heavenly realm began to fade around me, but the weight of the message I had received weighed on my spirit like a mantle of divine responsibility. I understood that I had been chosen not because of any special righteousness or wisdom on my part, but because God needed a witness to faithfully declare what had been revealed, without lessening the urgency or compromising the clarity of His warnings. The return to earthly consciousness was abrupt and painful. My spirit, which had resonated through dimensions of glory and revelation, found itself suddenly trapped again in broken, bleeding flesh. But even as physical pain flooded my nervous system, the visions remained vivid in my memory, preserved by divine power to be shared with a world that desperately needed to hear what heaven was announcing about the days to come.